Fantasy requires you to accept the existence of other realities, other worlds, provides an opportunity for spiritual themes to be explored.
Certainly the classic works of fantasy, the Tolkienian, C.S. Lewis fantasy, and then a lot of modern fantasy, it's rooted in the idea that there is a spiritual battle, a spiritual world. They all involve that sense of a cosmic conflict, of the reality of invisible forces, of things that can't be explained by the laws of science and the laws of physics.
It's that spiritual element that make the stories of Narnia and Middle-earth not just bestsellers, but cultural phenomena that continue to this day.
It is a remarkable thing that some of the very best, purely imaginative literature, if you like, fantasy literature, has actually been written by Christians.
Shall we play a game?
Why, yes, I believe we shall.
Oh, I got a live one here.
Live from Little Rock, it's Shane Plays Geek Talk, a journey into the things we love. I'm your host, Shane Stacks. If you're listening live on January 12th at 1 p.m. Central on 101.1 FM The Answer in the Little Rock, Central Arkansas area, or online at 1011fmtheanswer.com. So glad to have you. If you're listening by podcast a few days after the fact, or on Krypton Radio or YouTube or one of the many other venues the show goes out, I'm also glad to have you. This is, I love live talk radio, and I also love podcasts and everything. So this is the best of both worlds. There are, I won't lie, there are some occasional advantages to listen live. Sometimes I'll have, time-sensitive news to share or something like that. But really, whichever way you listen, you basically get the show. But I love my live show, for the interaction. If anybody wants to call in or tweet at me while I'm podcasting, I'm probably eventually going to fire up a Discord server or something like that so we can chat with listeners. I've had requests for that occasionally. But anyway, move forward. If this is the live version of the show, if you're listening on January 12th, you can call in if you so choose and desire at 501-823-0965. That's 501-823-0965. And you can also tweet me at Shane Plays. That's ShanePlays. I'll have some show notes to throw out later. First, I want to give out a couple of special notes here, and then I'm going to introduce my guests. The audio that you heard before the main show intro is from a documentary that I like very much called The Fantasy Makers, Tolkien, Lewis, and MacDonald. Now, you probably know the name Tolkien and Lewis. You may not know the name MacDonald, but he's a very important name in both fantasy and I guess Christian fantasy, if that's a term that would apply. And he was a big influence on many writers, including Tolkien and Lewis. And today's show, I just want to let people know. Now, I love what's happening in today's show because it's bringing together two things that are very important to me. First and foremost, my Christian faith. I mention it occasionally on the show, but since this is not a quote unquote Christian talk show, it's a geek talk show. It's just whatever. We talk about geek topics. It's usually we just focus on geek stuff. But the wonderful thing about the geek world is it can bring together people from all kinds of different beliefs, backgrounds, and preferences, and we have this geeky space that we share together. Well, now today's show, we are going to be overtly discussing Christianity because it's inherent to the topic of today's show in this documentary. Now, you don't have to believe in Christianity to enjoy today's show. You're not a terrible person if you don't believe in Christianity. Christianity isn't about I'm a better person than you. Christianity is merely I'm a sinner saved from grace, and that's the one of the concepts there. But again, Christianity is part of today's topic. I wanted to say a lot of the entertainment I enjoy is contrary to Christian beliefs, but I still enjoy it, and I use it as an opportunity to evaluate and test my own beliefs. So if you don't believe in Christianity, which again, that's between you and and your conscience and all of that, use it as an opportunity to test what you believe against maybe what we talk about today. But this is not going to be a hardcore, sinners in the hands of an angry God type show or anything like that. All right. Having said all of that, I have two of the people involved with this documentary on the phone. We actually have the writer, director, and producer of this excellent documentary, Andrew Wall, by phone. Andrew, are you with us?
I'm with you.
Hey, Andrew.
How you doing?
Yeah, good. Thanks so much for joining. I've watched the documentary this week. I actually own a copy. I got it at Mardell.
Cool.
And I've watched the whole thing all the way through once, and then I've watched other parts. Again, it's a fantastic documentary. And then we also have Derek White, also known as the Geek Preacher. Derek, are you with us, sir?
I am here.
There he is, by the wonderful electronic, fascinating particles of Skype. Where Derek has joined us. So the guys are going to be talking about, of course, your this documentary here today. The initial introduction, I think, Derek, I think I got introduced to you through Stephen Chenault of Troll Lord Games. And then, it's kind of led into us having that show. So I believe that's what happened. But Troll Lord and Stephen, all those are actually a sponsor of a Shame Play. So I love how all these connections happen and everything. So, but moving on, we will talk the majority of the show today about your documentary and the themes, and I'd love to know how it came together and all of that sort of thing. Before then, we'll have some notes and a brief news segment, and I have to banter with my engineer Zach, or else the head of my news team, Sal, his grandmother and her dog Muffin get upset with me. So I have to. But during all of this, you are all more than welcome to participate. So it's very much a participatory show. But as kind of what I call the icebreaker question, are either of you guys reading anything right now that you find is interesting or want to talk about?
I'm always reading something.
Yeah. And what would that be, Derek? What are you reading right now?
Well, a friend came into town just yesterday and showed me a bookstore I didn't know about, and it was a great used bookstore. So I went in and picked up some old used books that I read when I was a kid and haven't read in a long time. One is The God Makers by Frank Herbert, and the other is a collection of the Spellsinger books by Alan Dean Foster.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what I picked up there. And I'm also reading a book by Morgan Guyton about toxic Christianity. So there's
that
my
exists.
geekiness and my Christianity together right there in a nutshell. Kind of tells you who I am.
And I have no problem admitting, as a Christian, that there is some toxic Christianity out there. There is a toxic element to every group out there. And some of it's well-meaning, but anyway, how about you, Andrew? Are you reading or working on anything? I know you're a director that works on multiple projects. Are you reading anything, or do you have any other documentary projects you want to mention?
I have tons of stuff underway. We're actually in development with the science fiction makers, looking at it's similar to the science or fantasy makers, but looking at a variety of different writers that focused on Christian science fiction, including Madeleine L'Engle. So I'm reading A Wrinkle in Time right now. I don't know what it's about. I read it a long time ago, but I'm going through it again. And I'm also trying to take a break from mainstream news right now. I still keep up, but I just found myself reading way too much news with all the drama that's happening right now.
Yeah, speaking of toxic, yeah. So, I'll just say on that, there is news out there worth keeping up with. But on any given day, now there's exceptions to this, but on any given day, you can get your news in about 5 minutes and move on. But it's easy to get sucked in, and use it as a spectator sport or gladiatorial arena or cathartic yelling. I don't know. Anyway, speaking of the science fiction, go ahead.
I'm also reading The Tiger, which is a great book by John Valiant. and it's about a Siberian tiger out in eastern Russia. And it's an amazing book. I'd recommend it to anybody.
All right.
Based on a true story.
Oh, okay, cool. Well, that's all cool. So that's called The Tiger, and it's it's in Siberia. It's a true story set in Siberia.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, it documents. It's kind of a true story that was sort of put into a little more fictionalized sort
I gotcha.
of story, and it's a wonderful read to escape from all the news out there. So.
Excellent. Okay. Well, speaking of the science fiction makers, a lot of people, most people know C.S. Lewis wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. I would say the general reading public is probably not aware of his space trilogy, which I didn't become aware of until I was in my 30s. And so there's some really good stuff there too. And in fact, in some ways, the science, the space trilogy is just as powerful, if not more powerful, than Narnia. Especially for me, Paralandra. I loved Paralandra, which if I were, I hope I'm not messing because it's been several years, but it was basically what would happen if you had the chance to defend the Garden of Eden with the other planet, another planet being the Garden of Eden. So anyway, so can we assume that in the science fiction makers that the space trilogy will make its way in?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It would be L'Engle, C.S. Lewis, and we're not quite sure who would be the earlier. We're looking. There's a variety of writers that happened in the beginning of the 19th century that we're looking at right now. So it's kind of in development. So I get to read a lot.
Okay, well that's great.
And you talk about the space trilogy. I know I was scolded by a lot of scholars who said it's the Ransom trilogy. That C.S. Lewis would have not liked the idea of space, this cold, empty void. But it's more called the Ransom trilogy. And I love those books because it's interesting to see how C.S. Lewis thought the future or technology would be for space exploration. That really caught me. That was really cool.
Yeah, I loved I think it was in Out of the Silent Planet, where the reason they would call him the Ransom trilogy is because there's a fictional scientist named Ransom that is in all three. And I think it was Out of the Silent Planet where he spends most of the voyage like basically sunbathing in all the cosmic rays, and it's a whole different, because these were written before a really good understanding of what space was and all that. But they're fantastic books. So go ahead.
And it was so hot. It was so hot that they had to take their clothes off.
Yeah, exactly.
They were naked in the spaceship walking around.
Yeah, fantastic stuff if people have never read it. And then That Hideous Strength, which is the final book, it does involve some science fiction stuff and some fantasy, but it's a lot about moral relativism invading like education and society. So a lot of really good stuff there. But anyway, to make sure that we talk about the fantasy makers, I'm going to move us on. But definitely, as you're working on that, please stay in touch. I'd definitely love to talk with you about that as well. And in fact, it says the fantasy makers is, by your website and other marketing materials, says the Fantasy Makers is part of the Faith and Imagination series, a 3-part series filming throughout 2017 through 2021. So I'm assuming that the Science Fiction Makers is part of the Faith and Imagination series?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah. And we're not sure what the third one will be yet. It'll be either Apocalypse Makers or Game Makers.
Okay.
So looking at the Left Behind series, looking at those kind of things, or looking at some of the Christian games, fantasy games that have been out there as well. Excellent.
Okay. Well, we will definitely continue talking about the Fantasy Makers and the Faith and Imagination series later in the show. Let me. But I got to shift it on over. I got.
My vote is for the Game Makers.
The Game Makers. All right.
That's my vote for the third one, but Andrew already knows that.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, you are the Geek Preacher after all. So, okay. So, gonna chat with Zach here real quick. So, Zach, we talked last week. All right, Zach, the engineer, best engineer in the business. We talked last week that next week's show is going to be Dragon Ball Super Broly Ball. It's going to be, we're going to talk about Dragon Ball Super Broly, and then just sort of, hey, if somebody wants to get into anime, here's some suggestions for maybe. So, I just want to remind folks that opening up this next week's Dragon Ball Super Broly is in theaters, and just kind of looking. It's Wednesday night, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday. There's some other days. Just go to Fandango or whatever. Put in Broly, Broly, and it'll pop up. So. And I want to extend the invitation to you again. We'll be going Wednesday night. If you would like to go with us, you're welcome to.
Oh yeah, I'm free.
Yeah, okay. I'll send you a message about it. And then some of the guys I'm going to go see the movie with are going to come on the show.
Cool.
Next Saturday.
That's great.
Now, also we might have. We have the Mobley Detective Agency that often acts as a go-between between us and Sal's grandmother and her dog Muffin, who, by the way, we didn't get any communications from this week. So I have no update there other than their peace overture from last week. So Justin Mobley, who is a key member of the Mobley Detective Agency, may appear with us next Saturday.
Is that right?
Because he's a big anime fan.
That's cool.
Yeah. So now he said as a joke he might dress up like a dog. And I said, dude, we've installed automated anti-muffin defenses, so you need to be real careful about that. So I don't know what's going to happen.
That's funny.
I don't know what's going to happen. So, all right. So I bet you're looking forward to next week's show because you're a big anime guy.
Yes, I am.
All right. So, very cool. Another thing I wanted to I wanted to do some news real quick. Speaking of, I've only got one news item this week, but go ahead and turn on the microphone, super secret microphone in the newsroom, and we'll do this news item real quick. There they go, working hard on a Saturday. Folks, remember, for every $1 of Patreon support that the show gets, the news team gets a penny an hour raise. I'm still in negotiations with the newly formed union for possibly 2 pennies an hour per Patreon, but that's not. Have they reached out to you yet, Zach?
Not in 3 years.
Not in 3 years? You'd tell me if they have.
Yes,
okay. Because that's Sal. He's a good news team manager, but he's a slick one. All right. So anyway, this one's sad, but we had some sad news last week too. But anyway, and I imagine that this might be a news item that's up Derek's alley, is the Geek Preacher. Darwin Bromley, who is the co-founder of Mayfair Games, has died at 68. So Darwin P. Bromley, who's an attorney, and this comes to us via, oh darn it, I want to make sure to credit who it's from. It's like tabletop. I'll get it didn't print out the URL like it normally does on my thing, but I'll make sure to credit this news source in the show notes. But it's like a tabletop news gaming site. Darwin P. Bromley, attorney, game designer, and co-founder of Mayfair Games, has passed away at 68. He is survived by his wife Trella and their 4 children. Bromley was born in West Virginia, but moved to the Chicago area to attend school. Says he studied mathematics at Marshall University and obtained his law degree in 1975 from Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law. He most recently lived in Jacksonville, Florida. Now, from a geek perspective, if you will, Bromley co-founded Mayfair Games in 1981 with his brother, who also recently passed away. And he was the company president up until, it's from some point up until 1997. So his brother died of sudden illness in 2016, and Darwin recently donated the brother's game collection, which from what I hear was a pretty extensive game collection, to the Strong National Museum of Play, which was very cool. Preserving that kind of thing is very interesting. Preserving our gaming and toy and computer game history and all that is important, not just from a geek perspective, but really from an archaeological perspective. It's part of our culture. So it says at Mayfair, he helped create the first crayon-style train game, Empire Builder, with co-designer Bill Fawcett, and the company produced several games using this mechanic. Now, most people these days would hold up Mayfair Games as the importer of Settlers of Catan, which has absolutely exploded over the past 20 years. And in some ways, I call it the new Monopoly. So many people that you wouldn't think of as hardcore gamer geeks are playing Settlers of Catan, and that's introducing them to other style board games outside of like the Parker Brothers and Milton. There's nothing wrong with the old Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley games. I love them, but there's a whole other board gaming world out there. Where I have deep and abiding love for Mayfair was the 1985 DC Heroes role-playing game, which I loved and still love with a deep and abiding Smith. But I also give them huge props for being basically introducing Settlers of Catan to America. So
don't forget Roll-Aids.
And Roll-Aids. Yep, Roll-Aids.
Roll-Aids, man.
Roll-Aids.
That's some awesome geekery there, man.
Huge. Yeah, it's Roll-Aids. Now, we're not talking about the make your tummy feel better Roll-Aids. It's ROLE aids, the role-playing aids. They were a series of products in the 80s. I don't know if they lasted into the 90s or not. They were just sort of a lot of times they were system generic or system specific. This will help your role-playing game experience, but it was third-party type stuff. So, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
One of the first to be able to do that too, because their lawyers, TSR in the '80s sued a lot of people for using the name Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So what they did is they splashed on their cover, "This is for use with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, of whom we are not a trademark holder."
Right.
TSR owns the rights, and so they were able to really,
they won.
Unlike Judges Guild, who put out who paid TSR to use their name of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Yep.
Roll-Aids didn't do that and were able to slip by and put out some really good stuff.
Well, and TSR, who was definitely the 800-pound gorilla of role-playing games, they're like the Microsoft of role-playing games at the time. Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast is now. They won in court over that, which is not surprising, as you mentioned, Darwin was an attorney. So he's like, okay, all right, but anyway, like any industry, like any hobby, there's an industry behind it that has occasional spats. Bromley also helped establish the Gamma Game Manufacturers Association trade show as committee chairman and vice president. And he received the Gamma Merit of Service Award in 1990. Also, he was the show manager for the Radio Control Hobby Trade Association, is computer developer, consultant, active with the Boy Scouts, and he also worked to enable the Boy Scouts to earn the Game Design Merit Badge. So there you go.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, it's interesting when you study a lot of these people that make a big mark in an industry. All the other stuff they're like, these people are just dynamic. They're hitting on multiple levels. So it's really interesting when you study that kind of thing. So, well, that's the news. That's the news item for this week. I'm gonna get us to a break. When we come back, we're gonna have another piece of audio from the Fantasy Makers documentary that we're talking about today with Derek, the Geek Preacher, and Andrew Wall, who is the writer, director, and producer. Before that, I want to take a personal moment, if people will indulge me. I lost a good friend this week on Thursday. I had a cat named Bonnie that I had for 14 years, and her name was Buckaroo Banzai because I thought she was a he as a kitten, and then found out fairly early on that he was a she. So Buckaroo Banzai became Bonnie. She's also Bonner Bears, little Bonnie Foo-Foo, my wee Bonnie Lass, and Bonners, and many other things. And this Bonnie was a beautiful long hair, black and white domestic cat with green eyes. But she was also a handful. The first 2 or 3 years I had her, she was very difficult because she had fear issues. I literally had a vet tell me that they should send Bonnie to Iraq and the war would be over in one day. He came out after treating her. I'm not joking. His smock was ruffled and his hair was tousled. And another time she bit his finger. One time I took her in for and this is when she was sick when she messed him up, So, I mean, Bonnie didn't play. And she had, on her index card, she had 5 stars at the top. And that didn't mean because she was such a sweet girl. She got their highest. So Bonnie had street cred. I brought her into the vet one time when there was a new employee, and she went, "Oh, Bonnie," like, Bonnie. She'd heard of Bonnie. So my girl had street cred. And I'm glad, but I loved this cat. And I think one of the reasons I loved her so much is because she was so difficult and we went through so much stuff together. And I've often said, in fact, I prayed to God over her grave after I buried her on Thursday. And I said, God, thank you for giving her to me because somebody else might not have put up with her. And I love that cat so much, but I had to bury her on Thursday, and, took her in. She wasn't eating, and tumors had eaten out half her jaw. And she was, she was really old, and the surgery to try to fix that would have been incredibly hard on her. And in her case was even worse than in most cases. So I had to make that hard decision to put her down. But I love my Bonnie. And, some people don't get it. Some people don't get the pet thing. Some people don't get the cat thing or the dog thing. But I think as Mark Twain said, something along the lines of, I immediately trust anybody that loves a cat. And, I love my cats, and they have a lot more personality than people think. But I just wanted to, there for a few years, it was just me and Bonnie and nobody else in this little 700 square foot apartment, just having our hard way getting to know each other. But a friend of mine just sums it up. Coulter on Facebook after she passed, he said, Berserker Warrior Cat. And he put a gif of the Klingon death ritual where the Klingons are screaming, and that fit. Seems cheesy, but it really fit. But I love that cat. She taught me a lot about patience, and she taught me about love. And there were times, even though she was so mean, I remember being sick, and she would just curl up next to me and push into me all night while I was sick and stuff. So I love that cat. Death's an inevitable part of life, but I just want people to know that Bonnie existed and I loved her and she was a good cat. So we're going to get to a break. And then after that, we're going to continue talking about the Fantasy Makers documentary with Andrew Wall and Derek White, the Geek Preacher. Comic book lovers, visit thewildstars.com today. From the mind of author and comic book industry expert Michael Tierney, it's not just a comic book, it's a comic book novel. The Wild Stars is sci-fi and so much more. Learn the explanations behind UFOs and space gods. This isn't the Twilight Zone. This is the region of the Milky Way galaxy known as the Wild Stars. We guarantee you've never read anything like it. The complete comic book novel took 20 years to tell, with one reviewer noting, the story of the Wild Stars stretches ambitiously across space and time, from small-town murders to the destruction of planets, with every event given multiple layers of meaning. If you haven't read The Wild Stars, you're missing out. Visit thewildstars.com today. The die is cast. Plunge into worlds of fantastic adventure where dragons lie and the undead stalk the shades of your mind's imagines. Where creatures of legend plunder wealth through the horror of their passage. Monsters grim and foul hold the ecstasy of gold and the renown of glory. All this and more awaits you and your friends in the unlimited, fantastic world of the Castles and Crusades role-playing game from Troll Lord Games. Visit your friendly local game store or trolllord.com to get your copy today. A rules-light, adaptable game that has stood the test of time. 12 years in constant publication with no new additions. Castles and Crusades is the original, easy-to-play attribute check system. Join us and unleash your imagination. Visit your friendly local game store or trolllord.com to get your copy of Castles and Crusades today. Shane Plays Radio is blessed to have sponsors, and we appreciate them very much. However, did you know that you can also support the show as an individual for as little as $1 an episode? Simply go to patreon.com/ShanePlays.
Post-war, Lewis would attend Oxford University, becoming a fellow and tutor in English literature. Eventually, two inklings would have a profound impact on Lewis with a simple walk.
He's walking along, innocently having this conversation with Tolkien and Dyson, And the subject turns to Christianity. And Lewis says the kind of classic sneering Oxford atheist philosopher thing, where you go, oh, come on. Tolkien says, how can you be so reductive about that event as a piece of history, and it means nothing to you? And yet the great myths of death and resurrection moves you to tears. And Lewis says, yes, because it's myth, it's great, it's resonance, but alas, it's not true. Myths are lies, even though they are lies breathed through silver. And Tolkien says, no, they're not.
And Tolkien and Dyson said, well, stop thinking about Christianity in terms of doctrines. Think about it more as a story, as a sequence of events, of characters and drama. Think of it, in other words, like you think of the pagan myths that you have enjoyed so much throughout your life.
That the word myth does not mean false. What makes it a myth is that it continues to be told throughout time in different cultures, different people, and continues to be a powerful story.
But Christianity has a historical claim to it, so you can say that Christ was crucified under Pontius Pilate just outside Jerusalem roughly in the year AD 33, so you can locate it, you can place it.
And J.R.R. Tolkien helped Lewis to see that Christianity told a story about how the world began, about why it went wrong, about what could be done to put it right again.
And you can see, as it were, the two halves of Lewis's mind trembling, and what reconciles them is Christ.
He realized that Christianity is much better understood as a myth, a true myth, the true myth.
The greatest myth is also the available and historical fact. Both sides of your mind, your reason and your imagination, can be fully satisfied by this.
All right. Welcome back to Shane Plays Geek Talk, a journey into things we love. I'm your host, Shane Stacks. If you're listening live on Saturday, January 12th, you can call in at 501-823-0965, or you can tweet me at Shane Plays. The audio you just heard is a very powerful, I wouldn't say moment, a sequence of moments from the fantasy makers, Tolkien, Lewis, and MacDonald. This feature documentary, examines the profound impact that fantasy pioneers C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and George MacDonald have made on popular culture to this day. Combined with historical reenactments, the film travels from the halls of Oxford and Cambridge, where Tolkien and Lewis spent their careers as academics, the south of England, where MacDonald lived, and a lot of people don't know George MacDonald, but he's a very important figure in all this, as well as through North America to meet some of the most fascinating scholars who have dedicated their careers to the study of these three fantasy giants. And again, the Fantasy Makers is part of the Faith and Imagination series, a three-part series filming throughout 2017 through 2021. As we talked earlier in the show to writer, director, and producer Andrew Wall, it sounds like the Science Fiction Makers is coming soon. But again, we're talking with Andrew Wall, the writer, director, and producer, and also Derek White, the Geek Preacher, who I was introduced to, who has been instrumental in making the show happen. So thank you very much, Derek. So what I want to do, Andrew, since this is, you're the writer and director and producer, how did this happen? What led you to make this documentary?
Well, to be honest, my introduction to Tolkien was our English teacher in grade 8, bringing a box full of The Hobbit into the room, throwing it on a table and saying, read it, and walking out for the next month.
Okay, then.
It was actually a really negative sort of experience to connect to The Hobbit.
Yeah.
It was just chaos for the next month. He was going through some life issues, and so he was just disappearing every class, and we were supposed to sit there in a classroom of kids and read, grade 8 kids. So chaos would erupt every class. I don't think I really read it through. At the end of it, we watched the sort of animated version of The Hobbit, and that was my introduction to Tolkien. And C.S. Lewis, my sisters had the Narnia series, but they had lost everything except for the silver chair. So my childhood was having an empty box with a silver chair in it. So I really wasn't all that familiar or into Lewis or Tolkien. I did a documentary about 5 years ago on a Canadian music artist named Steve Bell. And he said, my friend Malcolm Geit is coming from England to write with me and to do a performance. And so we introduced Malcolm Geit. I had no idea who this man was. He is one of the top poets out there in the world today. He is a poet priest from Cambridge University. And Steve also said, oh, by the way, he's like one of the top experts on Middle-earth and Narnia. And I was like, oh, well, this is really interesting. And, you know, I'm always looking for new stories. I'm always looking for new ideas. And I started talking to Malcolm Guite about imagination. And all of a sudden, the ideas were flying left, right, and center. And I started digging into C.S. Lewis, started looking into Narnia, started looking into Middle-earth with a very different perspective. And the idea that you can be Christian and have an imagination. And not only that the two great fantasy makers of the 20th century, and now I would add Rowling onto that as the third, as she came in the late 90s. They were Christian.
Who was that? Who was that name?
J.K. Rowling.
Oh, J.K. Rowling. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
And I know she's controversial with some, but if you look deeper into what she's written and sort of I mean, she even says herself in a Time magazine article, she based it off the two pieces of scripture, sort of the ideas that are in Harry Potter.
Well, it says just to interrupt for a moment, sorry about that, but since this is a good moment to bring it up, it talks about in this documentary that the scripture that is on, or the whatever's written on Harry's parents' headstone, tombstones, is right out of it's that death will be defeated, right? Yeah. So I mean that's I'd never known that. You know, I thought that was pretty powerful.
It's 1 Corinthians 15:26.
Right.
The last enemy to be destroyed is death.
Right.
That was a fundamental idea of Harry Potter. And so that, to me, was just fascinating, that these heavyweights of fantasy literature were Christian. And then so the more I looked into it and thinking, well, maybe there's a story here, all of a sudden this name kept coming up, George MacDonald. He's kind of lives in obscurity right now because he's a Victorian-era writer. But he was sort of one of the first Christian fantasy writers. He writes some amazing stuff. It's a little hard to get through sometimes because it is that Victorian style in sort of the language. But he writes this short story called The Golden Key, which is just it is his. And he was a priest, by the way. He was a fired priest. His church fired him, and then he took to fantasy writing to sort of pay the bills,
support his family,
the children's mouths.
Yeah. Well, he got fired for two reasons, if I remember right, and you touch on this in your documentary. One, it is because of his bent towards fantasy and all that, but two, because he was so focused on grace, if I remember correctly. So it was controversial within his church, and so he got fired and ended up paying the bills by writing. And I urge anyone, go back, look at George MacDonald's works. Some of them are really short and really beautiful. Some of them are a little longer. And what really became the story was that George MacDonald was so deeply connected to C.S. Lewis, the inspiration for C.S. Lewis's writing in fantasy. And then also the harder you looked, you realized that Tolkien was also influenced deeply by George MacDonald. And also they were very similar, and they were great masters of creating secondary worlds. So you have Tolkien and Lewis and MacDonald, this sort of trinity of great fantasy makers, and they were also Christian, and that to me was the story. That they were Christian. It's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, because most people will conceive of Christians as if you have let me rephrase that. I would say a popular way of thinking of Christians and Christianity is unimaginative and closed-minded and just about what they're against and that sort of thing. And there's so much beauty in these writings about the love of God and grace and what things can be for and what we have to look forward to. In fact, I love the ending of Chronicles of Narnia where it just says each chapter was better than the first, and it just kept going on and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Another thing I really love about, and I don't think I've ever heard it put this way before in your documentary, or I'd never heard it put this way till I watched your documentary. It was the lady that explained that myths can be real. It's just a myth is defined by, I guess its longevity and its cross-culture and it going on and on and on. So if somebody's, well, it's just a myth, you can say, well, yeah, but, myths can tell a true story. So I thought that was really powerful too. Now, speaking of George MacDonald, I did a few years ago. I became aware of George MacDonald by reading biographies of Tolkien and Lewis. And I have read Fantasies. That's the only one I've read, but that was amazing. Now, that's not a short story. It's a, I don't know if it's an allegory or it's a series of adventures in fairyland, basically, but it has a lot of Christian symbolism and allegory and stuff like that in it. But I enjoyed Fantasies quite a bit. What about you, Derek? What was your involvement with this documentary?
Well, it's kind of a roundabout way. I first met Andrew when he was following around a Canadian church plant called Geekdom House. I met him at Gen Con. I had gotten to know the Geekdom House people through the internet and talking with them, and saw that they were doing a lot of similar things that I was doing. And in getting to know them, I invited them to come out to Gen Con and some of the work they did. For those who don't know, I've worked on and off with Gen Con, at Gen Con, holding a worship service there on Sundays during the gaming convention. And at that time, I was coming regularly and speaking at that service every year. I haven't been able to do it the last few years due to some health issues. But and so I was talking to the people at Geekdom House. I said, man, if you guys could come to Gen Con, we'd love to have you. We'd want you to be on our Faith and was at that time hosting a Faith and Gaming panel at Gen Con. And so the Geekdom House people came, and they brought Andrew with them because he was doing a documentary on their work, because they are specifically studying that intersection of imagination and faith. That's what they're doing. And they're doing it from a Christian viewpoint, but they're incorporating so many different other worlds and thoughts into that. And so Andrew and I talked a little bit, and he liked some of the things I had to say, I guess, and invited me to be a part of the documentary because this is, faith and imagination and geekery have just been a part of my life since I was a kid. And even though I didn't come to the Christian faith till my 20s, early 20s, I was a big fan of mythology. I read Norse mythology when I was 9 or 10 years old, did my high school term paper on mythology and its effects on ancient man. And so these are things that I've always loved. And I've played Dungeons and Dragons since the early 1980s, still play Dungeons and Dragons. And because of that background, Andrew asked me if I'd be a part of the documentary.
Yeah, and you have a few segments that are quite good. And I would also recommend people, if they get this documentary, which this is a good historical documentary on where some of the major fantasy of the 20th and 21st century is coming from. So even if, like I said at the beginning of the show, you don't have to be a Christian to watch this documentary. You're not a bad person if you're not a Christian. There's some great stuff in here. And one of the things in one of the extra bonus features, Derek gives his explanation of what he sees as modern day dragons. And I would recommend watching that. There's some discussion of what a dragon is in Western culture, what it represented, and you get into Beowulf, which is one of my personal favorite things of all time. There's so much good stuff in this documentary. Again, even if somebody is just wanting the history of fantasy in Western culture, there's so much good stuff in here. Speaking of where, I know I found my copy at Mardell. I was doing some Christmas shopping, and I had already been talking with Derek, so I saw it, and I just my hands whipped out like a mongoose and grabbed it. But where can people get this documentary?
I know it is available at Amazon online, and it's on with American Public Television, so that'd be PBS affiliates.
Okay.
Certain PBS affiliates are airing it. And up in Canada, it's been on Super Channel for, I think, about 6 months or so.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and so we're just starting to roll it out at the festivals and that kind of thing. And like you said, and I think that's the ultimate compliment. A non-Christian can watch this, and in fact, probably be intrigued. This idea that that why did Christians own fantasy? And like I said, I'd add J.K. Rowling to that as sort of the third or the 21st century, the early 21st century. Those ideas that are rooted in Christianity are also sort of the human story, wrestling with truth and virtue and sacrifice and what's important. And so I think that is a great compliment that you say a non-Christian can watch it. It's what I do. I'm not a ministry necessarily, but I make films, and I make films of things that are really interesting to me. And the idea that, three Christian fantasy makers were the de facto guys of the 20th and 19th century is what caught me.
Right.
It's a good story after all, and that's exactly what I think Tolkien and Lewis would say. They're the books they wrote were great stories, and that's what grabbed people.
Yeah, there's some fascinating stuff in here, and like I said, I would say, just on my own history, being a fantasy nerd, a geek, and a Christian, and into all of this, and I'm a huge C.S. I love Tolkien and I love MacDonald, but C.S. Lewis is one of my personal. Even if he wasn't a hero of the faith for me, he's an intellectual hero. He's just, his ability to explain just mind-blowing concepts in almost everyday language is just, and plus what he went through in his personal life. His what he personally struggled through going from being an atheist into being a believer, even if you don't agree with where he ultimately came to believe, everybody can identify with those crises of what do I believe, and you kind of feel like that you're pressing the gas and the brake at the same time until you get a resolution and get a breakthrough. Another thing that there's some nuggets in here that were new to me. Like I said, even being, I would say, already kind of a student of all this. One, I didn't realize that the Inklings had fallen apart like it did. There's a really powerful moment where C.S. Lewis's brother Warney has a journal entry where he says no one came. And I didn't know that had happened. So, even if people think they already know all this stuff, and there was some stuff about C.S. Lewis's early childhood, even though I had read Surprised by Joy, either it was new to me or I had forgotten about it. So let me do this. Go ahead, Andrew, go ahead.
There's so much that has been written about C.S. Lewis. And some of it was earlier stuff, people that knew him personally that wrote. It was a little biased in some ways. Sort of skipped over the rougher points of his life. His brother was an alcoholic and lived with him, and that's life. That's the reality that we all walk this earth. And I know a lot of people. In fact, I had a screening where some people took incredible exception that I indicated that his brother was an alcoholic. Not the great C.S. Lewis, but Alistair McGrath is in the documentary. He's from Oxford, great guy, and he has written what I see as sort of a de facto C.S. Lewis book, biography. Very neutral, very sort of looking at it through also all the information and letters that have sort of surfaced over time. And so Alistair McGrath, I would recommend you read that if you want to know about C.S. Lewis in a really good, concise book. I don't remember what it's called, but he's in the documentary, and that really has a lot of. It's a very sort of sober look from somebody who wasn't friends with him, didn't know him personally, and sort of gathered all the information and put it together in a really wonderful story. And it's also fairly straightforward to read as well. And there's a lot of those things in there about C.S. Lewis's life. That he was a chain smoker, absolute chain smoker. His carpet had never been cleaned, and so in the last year of his life, he has this young man named Walter Hooper that comes to help him, and there was like inches of ash.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised. He was a bachelor. Other than when Joy Davidman was at Gresham came along, he was a bachelor, two bachelors living together, Well, I got to do this real quick. I got to throw out some more love at a sponsor and we'll circle back. And then, we've only got about 5 minutes left. Radio goes so quick. I want to throw out some love to Game Goblins. Some goblins are your friends. Game Goblins is Central Arkansas's premier retailer of Magic the Gathering, Warhammer 40K, board games, card games, RPGs, miniatures, and hobby accessories. Call Game Goblins at 501-224-GAME or visit them online at gamegoblins.com. That's 501-224-GAME or gamegoblins.com. Conveniently located at 1121 South Bowman, right on the corner of Bowman and Canis in West Little Rock. That's over by Senor Tequila and Tropical Smoothie and all that, right across from Lowe's. And staffed by friendly employees, Game Goblins has expanded their store size, and there's plenty of room for exciting inventory and tables for play space. You'll like that space because Game Goblins has gaming events every day of the week. For all of your gaming needs, I heartily recommend Game Goblins. Make sure to check out their customer loyalty program that rewards you based on your actual purchases. Game Goblins earns your business and keeps it. First-time customers, mention Shane Plays and receive $10 off your purchase of $50 or more. Tell them Shane Plays sent you. Okay, so we got... What, about 4 minutes, Zach? Yeah. Okay, so we got about 4 minutes. Again, I wanted to ask, Andrew, how long did it, because you interviewed about, 14 different people and went to a bunch of different locations. How long did it take to put this documentary together?
Good question. I took about a year. But, when we actually started shooting, it was in, I guess, a year and a half ago. That's when we actually went to England, got all the main subjects, and then we, after that, took another couple of months of shooting throughout. We got Derek in Nashville and went through the East Coast and Vermont of the U.S. and then Ottawa in Canada. So it was about a year in total from when we finally had it done. And it was hard. There was, like you said, there's so many good nuggets and there's good things on the DVD extras. That was a very hard. I've never had a point where I've just been absolutely frozen. We had so much good stuff. There was so many moving parts in regards to theology and English literature and just big picture ideas with so many characters. As you mentioned, we had 14 different it was a very hard year, and I had multiple other projects going as well.
Wow. Well, it's good stuff. I mean, it's really good. Derek, let's say that somebody is not a Christian or is just interested more in the fiction or the the history aspect. What is something that you would recommend to them in here?
You mean
let's say you had a friend that you really wanted them to watch it, but you knew they weren't a Christian. You were like, look, I know that this is talking about the fact that they're Christians and everything, but I think you would like it because.
Well, actually, I have a number of friends who are atheists and agnostic who have watched it, and the response they gave me was, man, it's great seeing that Christians used to have such a rich imagination. What happened? And so what I would say to a person who's not a Christian, who may not even be a person of faith, but who loves the imagination, watch the Fantasy Makers, because it shows you there are Christians who love imagination, who love literature, who love writing, and who are very intelligent and can tell and weave wonderful stories. And at the very least, it'll show you hashtag not all Christians.
Right. And then, as Andrew pointed out, he even classifies J.K. Rowling in this group. So, and she's yeah, go ahead.
With Andrew, she classifies herself in that group.
Well, she put, like I said, I found out in this documentary, she literally put scripture on Harry's parents' headstone. I never knew that. So, anyway, all right, guys, I got to draw. We got about a minute here. Folks, again, remember, this is the Fantasy Makers, Tolkien, Lewis, and MacDonald, part of the Faith and Imagination series. I found my copy at Mardell Booksellers, but, go to Amazon. There was some other things mentioned earlier in the show. I'll try to put some stuff in the show notes. Wanted to mention the news item I had earlier was from Tabletop Wire. I want to go ahead and make sure to give them credit. And one of my favorite things to say about Aslan, and I would say Christian fantasy makers in general, he's not a tame lion. So I love that line so much. And then finally, guys, I have to do this to you. It's the bad joke of the week. Are you ready?
Go for it.
Okay. Andrew, did you sign the waiver?
What waiver?
All right. I'll just have to trust you. I'll just have to trust you won't sue me. All right. What do you call a Hobbit party? A little get together.
Oh.
All right, guys, I got to wrap us up. This has been Andrew Wall, writer, director, and producer of The Fantasy Makers, and Derek White, the Geek Preacher. Thanks, guys, so much, and we will catch everybody next time on Shane Plays.
Thank you very much.
I'm Doug Gresham. This piece is from The Last Battle. There was a real railway accident, said Aslan softly. Your father and mother and all of you are, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, dead. The term is over, the holidays have begun, the dream is ended, this is the morning. And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now, at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before.
Shane Plays Radio is blessed to have sponsors, and we appreciate them very much. However, did you know that you can also support the show as an individual for as little as $1 an episode? Simply go to patreon.com/ShanePlays.